Studying through the Bible and some of the Bible characters that we've come across, Joshua was one. And I remember reading something. What I try to do sometimes is just find all the information I can in Scripture, but also in secular writings on Bible characters. And I ran across a series about Bible men from a man by the name of Gene Getz. He's probably in his 80s. And he writes a leadership series, and he writes something in the lines of all the Bible characters like David and Joshua and Jeremiah and the Apostle Paul. And I remember when we were getting into study Joshua, I got this book, and it's chapter by chapter, and it goes through Joshua. And I remember chapter 3 was something that particularly interested me, and I liked really a lot of the points that he brought out. And I thought, this would be a good message to bring out this morning. And then that's what we're going to do. Most of the time, we will be in the book of Joshua, chapter 2. Joshua, chapter 2. But before I begin, I'd like to read to you a poem. My wife found this on the internet, and I read it to my brother, and I thought it was very, very appropriate for the time, and you'll understand when I read it. It's winter in Indiana, and the gentle breezes blow 70 miles an hour at 35 below. Oh, how I love Indiana when the snow's up to my gut. You take a breath of winter air, and your nose gets frozen shut. Yes, the weather here is wonderful, so I guess I'll hang around. I could never leave Indiana because I'm frozen to the ground. I thought my brother was going to drop the phone when I read that to him, and I'm sure the Beauvays will be glad to be going to Florida where it's a lot warmer. But I thought that would put us in a lighthearted mood, and let's turn to Hebrews, the 11th chapter. In Hebrews, the 11th chapter, we read a chapter here that we all know. It's a cloud of witnesses. It's really a hall of faith. Not a hall of fame, but a hall of faith. And I'm going to read some things to you. I want you to think about these names. And not only do I want you to think about these names that I'm going to read, I want you to think about what you know about their lives. Some of the good things and also some of the negative things. That, think about them as individuals and things that you know that are revealed to them in Scripture. I'm going to begin in verse 4, and then I'm going to tell you as each verse that I go, we're going to be skipping around. By faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain. I'm reading from the ESV this morning. I usually read from the NASB, but this is just a smaller Bible, and I'm going to read from it today instead of my phone. So it might read a little bit differently. Through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts. And through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. I want to go down in verse 5. By faith Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death, and he was not found because God had taken him. Verse 7. By faith Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of righteousness that comes by faith. Verse 8, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. Verse 11, by faith Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Verse 20, by faith Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. Verse 21, by faith Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. 22, by faith Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave direction concerning his bones. Verse 23, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Verse 31, by faith Rahab did not perish with those who were disobedient because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. Verse 32. It's almost like the Hebrew writer was out of time and he wanted to get these things in before he finished. And he says, and what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, of Barak, of Samson, of Jephthah, of David, of Samuel. Remember what I asked you before? Well, let's read on. Who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouth of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release, so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated. Listen to this next verse. Of whom the world was not worthy. How would you like God to say that about you? Of whom the world was not worthy. You know, I asked you at the beginning to think about all these people. Did you remember Noah getting drunk? Did you remember Samson, who was quite the womanizer? Brought a lot of shame to his parents. Did you remember David, that liar, that adulterer, and that murderer? And how about Jephthah? How about the vow that he vowed? And yet they are listed here. They are listed in the hall of faith. They are listed in God, the Holy Spirit, writing these things through the writer. And I kind of agree with Bill a little bit here. I do think that the writer is Paul by some of the way the language reads. But did you notice, I don't know if you noticed, but when I read verse 31, did you notice that I didn't read it full? Did you notice that I missed a couple words? I want to read verse 31 to you, and I want to put back those words that I omitted first of all. Verse 31. And I want you to notice it's almost like the Hebrew writer is running out of time, but this last one, all these ones that are marked by faith, by faith, by faith, he ends with this one, and then he says, in case I run out of, I'm running out of time about Samson and Jephthah and David, but this last one he says, by faith, Rahab, the prostitute, did not perish with those who were disobedient because she had been given a friendly welcome to the spies. How would you like to have that label for the rest of your life after you're dead? Every time Scripture gets opened up, and it gets opened up to Hebrews, the 11th chapter, while we still walk this earth, and you go to verse 31, there's always going to be Rahab the prostitute. I think about they've just announced the Oscars, right? They do that right after the first of the year. And do you remember in the Oscars that what happens before the Oscars? You ever heard of the red carpet? Can you imagine to be I remember one actor that caught my eye this year that was nominated for an Oscar, has been in the business 50 years, and he's never been nominated for an Oscar. But you might remember his voice. His voice is very distinct. He's in a lot of commercials. His name is Sam Elliott, and he has this very deep voice, and when he speaks, he just commends your attention. I believe one of the first films he made, and my mother is a very, very big movie buff, but was in 1969. It was a movie called Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And I never forget that movie. I really liked it. Paul Newman and Robert Redford were great big stars then, and they had a love interest. The two of them loved the same woman. And that actress's name was Catherine Ross. Well, she met a man on that set by the name of Sam Elliott, and they've been married over 50 years. He just got nominated for his first Oscar. Can you imagine him going down the red carpet and then saying, here's Sam Elliott, the adulterer, and his wife, Catherine Ross, the embezzler. They wouldn't do that, would they? They wouldn't give that title to them. They wouldn't point out people's flaws at a time like that. It'd be all glitz. And if you're going to a ball or you're going in something special and you're getting introduced by a butler, they wouldn't introduce you in that way. So you've got to ask yourself, Matthew doesn't do it. He gives her name and he doesn't have any connotation. Why did the Hebrew writer single her out as a prostitute? And I think you have to ask yourself that. Why would he do that? Does it seem very nice to you to do? I want you to go back to Joshua chapter 2, and I hope by the end of this lesson we can answer that. And I also like to, some of you may know why the book of Hebrews was written, and who it was written to, and why it was written, and that might tell you something. I'll give you a little quiz to think about as we go through. But in Joshua chapter 2, I want to begin. Perhaps you are one who was raised in I said it earlier this morning, in a godly home. You never came to the Lord later in life. You had very pious parents, and you were raised in a religious household. Do you know sometimes that happens where you get like that, and you can become really, you don't mean to, but you can start to maybe look down on others because you've got all the answers, You know what people need to be doing. You know what God has directed you to do. So you've never really, in your life, you've never really been on that other side of the coin, and that's great for you. And if your children, I have 2 children that really were raised like that. I wasn't. I kind of had both sides. But now you can imagine, let's set the scene for you, and I almost wanted to put up the map, but you know what's happening here. The Israelites, Moses has just died, and how would you like to be Joshua? You get to follow in the footsteps of Moses. Really, think about that. That's really something. You get to what? It's like, here, the job's yours now, Joshua, and we're going in here and we're going to conquer all these lands. And you remember that when Joshua was one of the 12 spies, you remember how the other 10, you remember what they said? Oh, those people are too large. Those cities are too fortified. And how that affected them for all those years wandering in the wilderness, and only him and Caleb had given a good report. And now we read through the end of Deuteronomy, we see that Joshua's kind of Moses' right-hand man, and he's being groomed for this job. And now he's getting ready to go into and conquer a walled city. And that's very important because in the time of this ancient time, walled cities were very fortified and they were hard to penetrate. And Joshua, one of the things in my study that I kind of realized about Joshua is Joshua was a very good military man. Joshua was, if you would say Joshua was a general, Joshua was a very good general. And you could tell he thought strategically and he thought smart. And I want you to look, and we're going to go to verse 1. And I want you to think maybe the Israelites were thinking about that when they came across Rahab. Here's this prostitute. What can she do for us? And in Joshua, in verse 1, let's look at verse 1. And Joshua the son of Nun sent 2 men secretly from Shittim as spies, saying, Go view the land, especially Jericho. And they went and they came into the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab, and they lodged there. Now let's think about that. Joshua sends out 2 spies, and here's some facts. This woman that they go into, she grew up in a totally pagan, in a totally idolatrous community. So much so that God did not want those influences on his people, and he wanted them to drive them out of the land and destroy them. And then yet, in this city, there's this prostitute named Rahab, and they happened to just come here. And they lodged there. Many things have been said, this is an inn. Some people think, no, it was what it says it was. It was a brothel. I don't know. I'll let you study that out. I do know a lot of times that spies want to go where strangers might go in places that would be kind of inconspicuous. But I'll let you study that out and you come to that conclusion yourself. But no matter what, it says that they came into the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab. I want to think maybe it was her residence. And they lodged there. So here they come, they're spies, and I wanted you to notice in verse 1 there, did you notice how many were sent? How many were sent? 2. 2 were sent. I found that to be kind of ironic, didn't you? Why only 2? Joshua was one of 12, wasn't he? And how many came back with a good report? 2. Only 2, him and Caleb. So only 2 spies were sent. Do you think Joshua's learned anything? Let me ask you something. Do you think these were 2 men that were kind of wavering? Do you think these were 2 men that were spiritual weaklings? I got a feeling they were his best soldiers physically and spiritually. I got a feeling that they were two soldiers who, when they came back, they would report. They wouldn't be feared of the people. They would bring back a good report. That's what I think about these two men. And you know, we think about Rahab, and a lot of places where she's listed, that title, prostitute, goes with her. Well, anyway, she lodges them there, and as Curtis read to us, we see this woman who is rewarded a place in Hebrews chapter 11 in the cloud of witnesses, and she's rewarded a place that kind of wraps it up. Like he doesn't want to forget her before he goes on to these others whom he's going to include. And you have to ask yourself, why would he give her that title? Well, right away here in verse 1, Joshua has a secret mission. He's sending two men. He's telling them, I want you to go view the land. And Joshua's going and he's sending these two spies out. And he's telling them, I want you to view the land. Why? Because it's a walled city. It's a walled city that needs to be penetrated. They're the army that's going to come in and they're going to conquer these lands. So he wants to make sure he knows what he's up against. So he sends these men, and I think they have two reasons why they go. And the two reasons, I think one of them was known to Joshua, and I think the other one was only known in the mind of God and not Joshua. I think that first reason is militarily. What I'm telling you, they went in there because they had to see the enemy that they were up against, and taking no chances, he sends two spies, and I think he sends two of his best spies on this secret mission. But the second, remember I told you that I think the second reason was not, I said there's two reasons, and I think one was only known in the mind of God. And you know what I think it was? I think it was God's love for a prostitute that he knew believed in him, a prostitute that he knew needed his help. I don't think Joshua knew that. I don't think Joshua's soldiers knew that. But I think God knew that. You know, we sometimes, I love stories about providence. And I remember one of the things, and people know Joseph is just a special character to me. There's so many things about what a flawed family and all the things that God does with this flawed family. But it's so powerful when he's standing before them and he tells them, don't worry, God brought me here. God brought me here to save you. And God's providence is so strong at the end of Genesis with him addressing his brothers. But you know another book that does that? A book that's God has not written on the pages one time. And that's the book of Esther. Do you remember what Mordecai tells her? Surely you were brought to this time. With your beauty, you go see the king. Because she had to save God's people. You know, in the book of Joshua, in the story of Rahab, you don't see it so much. It's kind of like what Proverbs 2 tells us. Discernment and knowledge is sometimes gotten from digging for it like you dig in a silver mine. And I think this is one of those times where we got to dig. Because I think the second reason was that God wanted to save a prostitute who believed in him. We see this by the actions that she did. She's listed in Hebrews 11 because she is a woman of faith. Faith is not something that you talk about. Faith is something that you do. Faith is something that causes you to act. And she does this. And that's, I think it's providential. I think God's hand is all through this. And I think that's something that we should see. I want you to notice that I've numbered my pages today. I'm not going to get up here and I'm not going to forget a whole page. So I thought about that when I was sitting and studying. It's like, okay, now make sure you go to every page and you get everything down and get everything said that you want to say. But I think God wanted to save a prostitute and her family. I want you to notice another thing about this, that you know what's great about the scriptures, and when I told you try to get as much information as you can, because sometimes people pick up on something that you didn't. You know what? That king of Jericho had a great surveillance system. You ever think about that? You know, we just got, you know, my wife's always she's really the technical guru, not me. As a matter of fact, Bill called her last night wanting to know how to send a picture. He noticed he didn't call me. He wants to know how to send a picture to his sister, so he calls Peg. Now, we got this video doorbell now because we get packages delivered to our house a lot. And every time, I can be at work in Chicago and I'll hear this thing on my phone and it's showing me a view of my house and around my house. Wow, that's great. We got spy satellites and we got video monitors. We've got drones. We can watch things in just the minutest detail. And now you see this king, he's got a pretty good surveillance system. And let me bring out why I think he does. I want you to read verse 2 with me. Verse 2 says, "And when it was told the king of Jericho, behold, men of Israel have come here tonight to search out the land." Well, there's some 5 things that shortly after the spies enter that house, the king already knows 5 things. He knows that he's aware that they entered the house. He's aware that 2 men entered that house, and he's aware they're together and they hadn't split up. He's also aware of where they're from. He's also aware of where they're from. He knows where they're from. He also knows the exact precise time that they entered the house. And then he also knows their reason. Now, I don't know about you, but that's some great, great surveillance. And what does that tell you? You remember when we studied in class this morning, and I told you that Solomon had Shimei live in Jerusalem, that you keep your friends close, but your enemies closer? You know what I think? I think when the Israelites are camped on the other side of the Jordan, I think that there's somebody watching them. And I think that they're watching their every move. And I think as soon as those men started to cross that Jordan, and wherever they trekked, I got a feeling the king of Jericho had eyes on them. He had eyes on them, and he knew everything they were doing. As soon as they get into that house, he's over there. Bring those men out. And that's just an incredible, that king knew precisely. Now, I don't know about you, but I think that's a great surveillance system at that time. Now let's look at, right now, Rahab is in a predicament. Now she has a test of faith to go through. I want us to read with me verses 3 through 7. And as I said, it may read a little bit differently if you're reading the NASB, but if you have a phone and you got a Bible app, go to the ESV and you'll read right along with me. Verse 3, "Then the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, Bring out the men who have come to you," he already knew, "who entered your house. For they have come to search out the land." They're spies, Rahab. Bring them out. But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. And she said, "True. The men came to me, but I did not know where they're from, you liar." She's lying. She knows exactly where they're from, and she knows where they're at. "And when the gate was about to be closed at dark, the men went out. I don't know where the men went," liar. "Pursue them quickly, for you will overtake them." No, you won't. They're upstairs. Rahab's test of faith. Did you ever ask yourself in this whole thing, why would she do that? Do you not think if they found those men, what is going to happen to Rahab? Those men are going to be what when they find them? They're going to be killed instantly. Well, what do you think is going to happen to Rahab? What do you think is going to happen to her family? They're going to be killed, most likely. Now, why would she do that? Why eagerness to protect your enemy? Why would you why would you do this? Why would you want to protect the sons of Israel? Why so much concern? And then, when you ask yourself those questions, there's one glaring answer that comes back to you, because Rahab had already changed her allegiance. You see, she believed in the God of heaven, and she didn't fear the king of Jericho. That's why she saved those men. That's why she put them upstairs. And that's the basic answer that you have to come to. Now, I can't get around this. I asked Peg as I was studying this, and I didn't let her know what I was studying, but I said, "Peg, can you think of a couple people who lied in the Bible and God seemed to be pleased with it? Or it seemed to benefit God's people?" And you know what she said? One of them that she said? Rahab. Want to know another one? Remember the Hebrew midwives? Why are you saving these sons? Why aren't you getting them when they're delivered? We've told you to kill. Oh, the Hebrew women, they just give birth too quickly. We can't get, they give birth too quickly. They have these children. You notice what God said? He looked favorably upon them. Am I telling you that it's okay to lie? No. Me and Peg talked about that. I can never tell you that it's okay to lie. God tells me that it's a sin. And how do I discern that this is the time that I should lie, God? I don't know that. Only He does. But I can tell you in this instance, was she lying? She not only lied once, she lied several times. She knew she was lying. They were right up there. And I want to get a little bit into that. I told Albert that I was thinking about him last night. Because I was trying to think in here the men that I knew who was in the military. And I knew Albert was, and I knew Tom Schmidt was, and I knew at least I was. I thought there were a couple more. I know you were, and I know Kenny was, and I'm going to get back to that. But I want to go, and here's Rahab's test of faith, and she's hiding these men to the threat of her own life and her family. If you want to know about the midwives, you go into Exodus chapter 1 and verse 20. And then I don't want to just spout off things and not tell you where you can find them in the scriptures. But one thing that's amazing about Rahab and why I think she's listed in that cloud of witnesses, because Rahab didn't have half the light that the children of Israel did. But she responded to the little bit of light about God that she had. And let me show. Now, Rahab was way ahead of many of the children of Israel here. Their light was greater. Didn't Israel in that generation, even though that generation fell, their children were alive? Didn't they see the parting or hear about the parting of the Red Sea? Didn't they know that the children of Israel came on dry ground and the Egyptians were swallowed up? Didn't they see miracle after miracle? Didn't they see Moses or hear about God gave them a direct revelation of Moses' law from the mouth of Moses, which he got from the mouth of God face to face? They knew about all those things. You want to know what Rahab knew? What she heard. Not what she saw, what she heard. They had it directly, she had it indirectly. They had seen miracle after miracle. Rahab only heard of them. The children of Israel received the Mosaical law by a direct revelation of God through Moses. Rahab only heard indirectly. Starting to understand why she's listed there? We're going to get why I think that title has gone with her. Even with all this light, the children of Israel, time and time again, turned their back on God. And it seems to me that God is giving greater attention to detail. One of the things in the military they teach you, at least they did me, is that was a saying that's come, I still think about. Attention to detail. You're given an order, you pay attention to it, to the minute, right down to what you're directed to do. Attention to detail. We had to know, when we went out for an inspection, how you dress, how you walk, how you talk. You had to make sure everything was, you know what I mean, Albert. You had an inspection, the general was coming, your barracks. You had to make sure that things were folded and that they were folded the right way. You had to make sure that things were clean, they were cleaned the right way. It's just you had to pay attention to detail. And sometimes it was very, very tedious things. And I got a feeling that it wasn't about cleanliness. I don't think that's what it was about. I got a feeling it was about because in the heat of a battle, when I tell you to do something, you're not going to question me. You're going to do it. Now, this Rahab, her faith was great compared to Israel. I think her faith was greater. She had a great... Now, she's willing to hide the spies, and not only is she willing to hide them, she's willing to hide them in her home. And one thing that we know about Rahab, do you think she knew that the king had a good surveillance system? It seems like if the king came there and he sent men and he'd already seen that they went in, and he sends them in there, and they go in there, and he has already all the information, she's already hit him. She must have knew that he'd be coming and knocking on her door, that there would be soldiers that were coming to try to find out, because she is already putting, she's already showing her willingness to hide these spies. She knew about the king's surveillance. She knew her risk was great. And you know, the king, I just can't get over that. In order for the king to know everything he knew, he had to be following their every move. And there's another question that comes up if you know that. If you know that the king's following their every move, he knows where they're at, he knows where they went, he knows so much that he goes to the house and says, bring them out. Why? I want to ask all of you, but ask the military men especially, why would those soldiers all of a sudden believe that Rahab? You don't see God's providence in that? Why would they all of a sudden say, okay, Rahab, I believe you, and go out in the dark searching? You want to know what I think I'd do? I'd search that house. I think I would search that house, and I think I would walk up those stairs on the roof, and I think if I saw that flax, I think I would be poking something, seeing if there's any bodies laying in there. But they don't do that. All of a sudden, they are mentally blank. I see a miracle. I don't know about you, but I see God's hand all over this. I see God's hand wanting to save a prostitute and her family because they believe in him. And so all of a sudden, they don't do that. And now let's look. I want us to point out some things here. Ask ourselves some questions. Why didn't they search the house? Well, in the human view, you might say, well, she wouldn't surely be foolish enough to hide those spies. She knew her life would be at risk. Who in the world would do that? Well, the divine perspective here is that it was a miracle, that God was saving her in that house. In my heart, I tend to go there, because it just seems to me that the way these soldiers of the king act and the way they know, all of a sudden just really everything they did up until the time where they leave made sense. When they left, the way they left did not make sense to me. Because as a soldier, and I ask those in the audience, as a soldier, you would know that if you're given a directive like that, back then, now you'd be court-martialed and you'd be probably put in prison if you would do this, and then they would find out later that your enemy was hiding up on the roof. But back then, they would have just killed them. Their lives would have been, if those two men were discovered up there, their lives wouldn't have been worth, as a Texan would say, a plum nickel. They wouldn't be worth anything. So, I just think you have to look at God's hand all through this. God was honoring Rahab's faith. She had passed the test, and God would protect her. Now let's read and conclude. My lesson's not very long, but let's look at verses 8 through 11. And we want to go through this, and I want to tell you some things about Rahab. You know, Rahab, and after she sends the men out, verse 5, and when the gate was about to be closed at dark, the men went out. I don't know where the men went. Yes, she did. Pursue them quickly, for you will overtake them. But she had brought them up to the roof and hid them with the stalks of flax that she had laid in order on the roof. So the men pursued after them on the way to the Jordan, as far as the fords, and the gate was shut as soon as the pursuers had gone out. You know, one of the things about Rahab's house is it was in the wall. That becomes a little more important later on, and I'm not going to get into that. But that's kind of something to think about too. Before the men lay down, she came up to them on the roof. This is God's providence, I think. And she said to the men, I know. She didn't say, I think. She didn't say, I speculate. I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard. She didn't see. She just heard. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the king of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and to Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted. And there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God, in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. You see, she has changed her allegiance. I don't think Rahab, do I think Rahab was a prostitute? Absolutely. Do I think she was at this time? No, I do not. But I think that label, now we have to get back in wrapping this all up. Because of Rahab's view and what she said there, and you have to, her convincing, she knew all these things. She didn't think them, she knew them. She knew what God had did, and she knew, and I felt that Rahab, the reason she hid those men, and the reason she risked her own life, and the reason that she did that, knowing that the king of Jericho was watching everything they did. It seems to me that he probably saw the minute that they crossed the Jordan. I got a feeling he knew where they were camped. And when she hid those men, you know what I think? I think she knew God would protect her. I think she had that much faith. I think that's why she's listed in Hebrews 11, because she feared God more than she feared the king. Just like the Hebrew women. They feared God more than they feared the king's edict. The willingness to protect her life for the men of Israel, as I said, is already strong allegiance that Rahab had changed her allegiance. You know something that's glaring here too? Didn't all the other Canaanites know the same thing? Didn't she say that they all melted and they all were fearful of the Israelites, that they knew what they were doing, they knew that they were marching, and they knew wherever they went they were defeating their enemies? It doesn't say they did anything about it. You see the difference between faith and you can acknowledge something, but that doesn't mean you'll do anything about it. You can believe in God but never obey his word. You see, faith to be faith has to have some obedience to it. It has to have some responsibility tied to it. She believed God so much that she was responsible enough to put her life on the line and do some works that showed that. She hid the spies. She did that. She believed that God would protect her. And I think that's, now going back to Hebrews chapter 11, remember I told you we'd wrap up? But the difference between her and her comrades is she acted on what she believed. So why would the Hebrew writer do this? Why would he give her that title? Well, if you know anything about the book of Hebrews, it was written at a time to encourage Christians not to leave the faith. There were times when they were being locked up and they were being pursued not only by their enemies, the oppressors, but even some of the Jews that didn't want to let go of the old law. And they would be prosecuted. At the end of this book, it talks about Timothy being let loose. And you know a reason why I kind of tend to agree with Bill? When I read that statement, Rahab the prostitute, I think about Paul's writings in Romans where he says, and such were some of you. See, that's the key. It's not where you're at or where you've been. It's where you're going. God doesn't care about what you did. Don't sit there and have that much pride. He doesn't care about whatever sin's in your life. He wants you to get rid of it. He wants you to get rid of it, and he wants you to go ahead. And you know something that we often don't see? You see that name Rahab in Matthew? It's in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. And how about when you read the story of Ruth and you think about what a marvelous woman who took care of her mother-in-law, Naomi. And you know in that story, I think about a man. I think about a man who's so good that says, you know, a man that's in charge and he sees her out there gleaning and he says, you know, I want you to take care of that woman and her mother-in-law. I want you to make sure that you leave enough. That man must have had a great mother or a grandmother. You know who it was? It was Rahab. We see that in the genealogy. Read about the genealogy of Boaz. It's connected to Rahab. I think she was a godly woman who from that time on remained godly. I think that's why she's listed in the Hall of Faith. And I think Paul's telling us, whoever wrote it's telling us, it doesn't matter where you come from. It matters where you're going, not where you've been. You remember when I said sometimes our pride gets in the way? I think we need to realize that, you know, and I don't even know if I should say this, but I'm going to. You know, somebody's getting ready to maybe walk through these doors in a couple months that doesn't have such a good checkered past. You know what I'm talking about, don't you, Bill? Will we judge him or her already? Some of us probably will. But you never know. People are defined not about what him or her has done, but about what they do from here on out. You know, and I always think about a verse in the Bible that I think we really need to pay attention to a lot more. You'll know them by their fruits. If somebody is an imposter, you'll know it. Their lives will show it. Sooner or later, they will reveal who he or she is. To me, when I read the story of Rahab, I think she's given that title because maybe there's some other prostitutes out there who God's saying, you know what, you don't have to be where you're at. You can come back to where you're at. You can come back to where you're at, and you can be with me, and you can believe just like Rahab did. And I think that's why I don't think she cares. I think she was a godly woman. When I think about Boaz and I see the kindness that he showed to Ruth and how he did everything just right, the way God's law did it. He went to every person. You have to think, he probably had some godly parents. And that's a wonderful thought to really think about Rahab. She not only believed for the moment when her life was in jeopardy, I think the scriptures reveal to us, if we dig into it like that silver, that she believed for the rest of her life, and she raised a godly son. I think that's just, when I wanted to bring this out to you, there's a whole lot more in it. I could probably do 3 or 4 sermons on it, on the whole chapter. But I remember reading about this, and when I came to that chapter, I just thought that Mr. Getz did a great job of bringing out some things that I didn't see. And that's what study does, though. It's all there in the scriptures. It's just you have to just take a verse and dissect it and think about it. And I don't know about you, but I really, really enjoyed just really seeing how detailed her faith was and just how much she really did. If you're not a child of God, you may have come from a past like Rahab. And you saw today that it does not matter. It does not matter where you're at or what you've done. Please don't have that much pride in yourself. Because one thing that I realized in studying David, as I'm sure Bill and Tom and anybody who's taught Dale, when you study these biblical characters, you realize we live in a flawed and broken world with flawed human beings. All throughout Scripture, these people, when they're mentioned in Hebrews 11, what's mentioned about them? Their faith. They all had flaws. They all did terrible things. So when you think you've done something so terrible, or your sins are so, don't think of yourself that highly. Because everybody has come from checkered backgrounds or had something in their lives that they don't like. So just think about that. God is able to save you no matter what you've went through. By hearing, believing, repenting, confessing, and being baptized, I guarantee you there's not a better decision you can make for you. Not a better decision, because you will have a focus that you really never had before. And if there's something that's went awry in your life, and maybe you've reverted back to some of these sins, God's able. He wants to and he's willing to. And he will right now. And if you're subject in any way, please come forward while we stand.